Michael, welcome to the program. Welcome back to the program. It's been a while. BrennanCenter.org, by the way, I should say, is the website, and the Twitter handle is M.A. Waldman. You wrote an absolutely brilliant piece this morning, published over at Brennan Center. Actually, I guess it was in January, titled "Why Opponents of Voting Reforms Are Wrong." I'd like to just, if it's all right with you, just go through these arguments that are being made and get your rebuttal. The first being that the argument that Kyrsten Sinema made on the floor of the Senate last, I think it was Thursday, where she said that election reform has to be done on a bipartisan basis. What say you, sir?
Well, bipartisanship is good, is nice, but if you look at the whole history of the country, as this book, The Fight to Vote, does, it turns out that most of the time, protections for voting and expansions of voting rights are done by one party over the objection of another. When it comes to voting rights, they don't kind of hug it out, they duke it out. And that's most famously true, I think, when we note that the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which was the amendment that protected the right to vote for black men, was passed on a party line vote. But it was far from the only one. So it's not an excuse, I don't think, to say, well, we'll only do protections for voting rights on a bipartisan basis, especially when, as you know, and as your listeners know, in states across the country, right now, Republican legislatures are ramming through restrictions on voting entirely on a party line basis.
Yeah, and with majority votes. By the way, there are no filibusters in the states.
They don't have a filibuster in these states. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So the other argument, or another argument that is made, and I went on an extended rant a few months ago about voting in Texas, and this woman called who was very, very eloquent. Probably maybe a politician or a think tank person. I'm not sure. Kind of presented herself as an average caller, but had all these facts and figures about how easy it is to vote in Texas and how there is no voter suppression in Texas, and these laws don't actually suppress anybody's vote, and anybody with half a brain and an ounce of wisdom can figure out how to get around them, and what are you all so worried about? So there's no need to undo these changes in voting laws because they're just tightening things up around the edges, but they're not actually preventing anybody from voting.
Judge Richard Posner, a very famous conservative judge, who actually wrote the opinion in 1986 that kind of began to uphold the modern voting restrictions, had a real change of heart. He came to see these things as voter suppression, and he said, all these people are spending all this effort to pass these laws thinking they will restrict the vote, and all these other people are spending all this effort trying to stop them. Maybe they're onto something. It's just an argument that doesn't hold water. We see that the state legislatures right now are being driven by the big lie, by Trump's false claim, that the election was stolen and that we have to make it harder for people to vote because of all the theft of elections. One thing that people don't really focus on, I think, and even there's just a lot of people who miss this point. A lot of the worst laws up until now have been blocked by the courts or softened by the courts. Take Texas. You might remember in 2013, Texas implemented a really harsh voter ID law. That was the one that said that you could not use your University of Texas student ID to vote, but you could use your concealed carry gun permit. I wonder how they came up with that.
Right.
Well, instantly, as soon as that was implemented, according to a federal court, 608,000 registered voters didn't have the paperwork, suddenly weren't eligible to vote. These are not, maybe they'll vote someday. These are existing registered voters. Well, what happened was my organization, the Brennan Center, and Latino groups and others sued, and the courts actually changed that law. Well, what happened more recently? This past year, the Supreme Court once again gutted the Voting Rights Act and took away the protections from the courts for voters for so many of these matters. It is open season right now, And that's why it is so important that there be federal legislation, because the courts are not going to protect voters. And it's only going to get worse from here.
Are you talking about the case where they upheld Ohio's right to basically do caging to purge people from the voting rolls?
Unfortunately, as the federal courts and especially the U.S. Supreme Court have become dominated by extreme right-wingers, and I'm talking about the Supreme Court, where there is now a 6-vote supermajority of conservatives, they are offering less and less protection for voting rights. Sometimes you see state courts doing it, but we cannot look to the Supreme Court, I fear, in the end, for protection on this.
Yeah. What do you say to those who suggest that gerrymandering is not that big a deal, that it's been going on ever since Elbridge Gerry, who was, one of the signers of, I believe, the Constitution, going back a long, long way in any case, what are you also so upset about here with this gerrymandering stuff?
Well, it's interesting. Elbridge Gerry actually refused to sign the Constitution, but he was there.
Thank you.
Look, it is absolutely true that gerrymandering was not invented last week. It's gone back to the beginning of the country. In fact, in the very first congressional election, Patrick Henry drew a congressional district to try to keep James Madison from being elected. So this does go back a long way. And it's also true both parties do it when they can. What's different now is, first of all, computers have made it all a lot more sophisticated. 10 years ago, the Republicans in a lot of states really egregiously gerrymandered. And what we're seeing this time, as the maps are being drawn all around the country in response, to the every 10 years census, in parts of the country, it's not as bad as in previous years, either because there's been redistricting reform like commissions, or even just because the Republicans control, say, the legislature and the Democrats control the governorship, like in a place like Pennsylvania. But in a lot of the country, especially in the South and Southwest, that's where the population growth is. It's almost entirely communities of color, especially Latinos and Asians. And the legislatures and the governments are entirely controlled by Republicans. And they are gerrymandering to the hilt to keep these voters of color from being represented fully. That's why the Justice Department, that's why civil rights groups have been suing on these maps. Again, sometimes there's a chance to overturn them in state courts, sometimes even in federal courts, but it looks like it's going to be pretty imbalanced. And, you hear Democrat, one of the recent thoughts is there have been some articles from a Democratic Party partisan perspective saying, hey, we're doing okay in this. Let's not worry about it so much. Well, first of all, that doesn't speak to the representation of voters of color, but it's also the case that the way these maps are drawn, if it was basically a tie like it was in 2020 in the legislative elections, it wouldn't necessarily change the maps that much. But if it's a good year for the Republicans, as it very well might, a lot of seats are going to tip into their laps.